All right. Well, good morning. If we haven't gotten to meet yet, my name's Tyler. I'm the youth pastor here, and we are closing out our series for the summer in which we've been talking about personal holiness. We started off by looking at the plan of salvation, what that process looks like, moving from death to life, and then growing in our Christ-likeness, growing to look more like Jesus. A word that we use for that is sanctification. And our last topic for consideration this morning is the topic of holy sexuality, holy marriage, holy intimacy, and specifically we'll be focusing on the physical side of intimacy this morning when it comes to personal holiness. Please understand that we could preach a whole series on marriage and intimacy and related topics, so today is not going to be an all-inclusive message on every aspect of the Christian sexual ethic. You will leave and you'll think, oh, he didn't talk about that, or he forgot to mention this, or there's that other Bible verse that he should have read. Listen, I thought about all of them, but I didn't think you wanted to be here for 4 hours. So we're going to do a 10,000-foot view this morning, and we're going to achieve what we can in the limited time available to us. Before we start, just to maybe calm some of the nerves that you might have when you hear that the sermon is about sex, I'm going to tell a story. There's a pastor who I respect and look up to, and he talks about how when he was in college, he met a woman who was in her upper 20s, and she was going back to school. She was a single mother. She was trying to go back to college to get her degree, and him and his friends took up the task of trying to care for her and serve her and her daughter and help lead them to Christ. And so they would do things like they would go over to her house and they would babysit for free, they would give her rides to class, etc. And they would help her work through the wisdom or lack thereof in some of the life decisions that she was making at that time. For an example, she was having an affair with a married man, and so they would kind of just explain to her and serve her and pray with her. And one day he invited her to this worship event because one of their friends was in a worship band and the church was hosting this worship night, and he framed inviting her to this worship night by saying, hey, one of our friends is in a band, you should come here and play. And now, of course, she thinks that what she's showing up to is some kind of rock concert, and they actually pull into the parking lot of a big church. And in the middle of the night, there was a pastor who stood up and he began his talk by saying, tonight, I want to talk to you about sex. And of course, the pastor who's telling this story begins to think, like, uh-oh, this could be a problem. This might push away this girl that we're trying to minister to if the speaker handles this topic poorly. And the preacher for the night then proceeds to take a rose out from underneath the pulpit and talk about how beautiful it is, talk about how nice it smells, talk about how pretty the petals are, and then pass it around in a room of about 800 young adults while he gives what this pastor telling the story describes as the worst handling of sex in a sermon he has ever heard. He says it's fear-mongering at its best, at its worst is like everyone's smiling until you have syphilis on your lip, like just the worst possible sermon about sex that you could ever possibly think of. And then at the end of the message, this preacher's big point, like the pinnacle of his message, was to say, hey, where's my rose? Like, where's the rose out in this crowd of young adults? And some college kid brings it up, and it's all broken and disheveled, and a bunch of the petals have fallen off. And the pastor's big thesis statement is to hold up this broken, disheveled rose and say, now, who would want this? His point, of course, trying to be that, you should abstain from sex because you don't want to end up like this rose with all the different sex. And the pastor telling the story said it took everything in him not to stand up and do one of two things: punch the dude in the face or scream, Jesus wants the rose! Like, that's the point of the gospel. That's the point of Christian faith, that all of us, whether it's in the area of sexuality or otherwise, look like a disheveled, broken, imperfect rose, and that's exactly who Jesus wants. And so my reassurance to you is no matter how far away from the life that you've lived to this point, the description of biblical sexuality sounds, you are never too far gone, you are never too far broken for Jesus to want the rose. And that's where I want to start as our baseline when we dive into a topic like this, the area of sexuality. I want you to just take a collective breath. I'm not here to guilt. I'm not here to fearmonger. I'm not here to berate anyone. I am simply here to put before you what God says in His Word about sex and to call you to holiness in light of the gospel of grace, that no matter how much brokenness you or I have experienced in this area of life, even if all the petals feel like they have fallen off, that Jesus still wants the rose. And so if you have a Bible, I'm going to invite you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. It'll be on the screen for you, but it also will be on page 1071 in the orange Bibles in the pews. We'll be in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and we're going to start down in verse 12. All right, 1 Corinthians 6:12. Again, it's page 1071 if you've got the orange Bible. I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. You say, food for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. The body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By His power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and He will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ Himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with Him in spirit. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own, and you were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command, for I wish all of you were as I am. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift and another that. And now to the unmarried and the widows, I say it is good for them to stay unmarried as I do, but if they cannot control themselves, then they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So the big idea, the thing that I want you to take away this morning is simply this. Holy sexuality does not treat sex as degrading, nor does it turn sex into an idol. And holy sexuality glorifies God and not pleasure, and it serves the desires of my spouse more than me. So the first sentence is about a spectrum. It's not degrading, it's not an idol. And the second sentence is about its purpose. It's for the glorification of God more than my pleasure, and it's for the serving of the desires of my spouse more than the serving of my own desires. In any conversation about sex that takes place in the church, most people expect to get something along the lines of that pastor, that preacher, from the opening story. But for Christians, we've actually been blessed beyond measure that God has actually chosen to reveal Himself to us in a number of ways, including the Holy Scriptures. So just to bring some balance to this conversation, because I'm going to talk first about what holy sex is not in just a minute, I want you first to understand that the Bible is not sex negative, because God is not sex negative. In Genesis 1, anyone know what the first thing God tells Adam to do after they're made is? Be fruitful and multiply. And by the way, they're naked. God created sex. It was His idea. That's why it's so important that we pursue it for His will and not for our own. He could have designed us to reproduce however He wanted, but He chose that one. Additionally, God, as the creator of mankind, who knit together every single molecule of you in your mother's womb, created you with body parts that exist purely to respond to sexual stimulus. He didn't have to put them there, he did put them there. So clearly, they have a purpose. If you still don't believe me, here's just a quick Bible verse for you. This is from Proverbs 5:18 and 19. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth, a loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breast satisfy you always. May you ever be intoxicated with her love. Who had the word breast on their church bingo card this morning? There's an entire book of the Bible called Song of Songs. It's a love poem depicting a back and forth between a bride and groom, written in a very expressive style, including their rejoicing on their wedding night. God put this stuff in the Bible for a reason. The Bible is actually, in fact, the most sex-positive book that exists because it celebrates the gift of God while also providing us with the needed wisdom to understand how to properly enjoy this gift, which is ultimately done for our own safety. We have to follow the manufacturer's instructions. Any of you in here fans of the movie A Christmas Story? You know what I'm talking about, A Christmas Story? I love that movie. We watch it every single year on Christmas Day. What happens, ultimately, when you get to Christmas Day in that movie and Ralphie goes outside, he gets the Red Ryder BB gun that he had been wanting. In typical, 1960s and 70s fashion, he gets zero adult supervision from his parents with a gift that has the potential to seriously injure him. Sex is a lot more powerful than the Red Ryder BB gun. And God is a much better gift giver and supervisor than Ralphie's old man. And so he gives us a set of guidelines, of manufacturer's instructions, not to hinder the gift that he's given us, but to allow us to use it properly. And so first, in our passage for today, we see two competing ideas from the time that Paul is writing. The first one we might call as sex as an appetite, and the second we might refer to as sex as a disgrace. So the first one, sex as an appetite, is typified in verse 13, where Paul quotes what is likely a Corinthian slogan or a commonly used phrase from Corinth at that time to justify sexual promiscuity. 13 at the beginning, it says, "You say food for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy them both." The claim here is that sexual desire is merely an appetite, and the satisfaction of this appetite is as morally neutral as eating something when you feel hungry. And that last sentence, "but God will destroy them both," is a bit of Greek influence, Greek philosophical influence that has crept in to the church in Corinth and affected their theology, because in much of Greek philosophy during that day, the material world, the physical world, was considered inconsequential. All that mattered were the spiritual things, the philosophical things, the things that were greater than just what we can touch and see. And so in their eyes, that meant that what you did with your body didn't matter. You could do whatever you wanted with your body because the material world was inconsequential. And part of this comes because Corinth was a very densely populated port city that was a center for commerce, and it attracted a diverse population from all over the Roman Empire to live there. And so because the population was so diverse, there were a number of different religious and philosophical influences in the city. Because it was a port city, a commerce city, there was a lot of money flowing around, so it became a place where people could satisfy themselves and seek to elevate their social status. Think Los Angeles, San Francisco, maybe New York City. The culture of Corinth is described as a highly egocentric, highly individualistic, and highly competitive society. People wanted to please themselves, they only thought about themselves, and they wanted to get to the top of the social hierarchy. And Corinth, because of this, was a morally unbridled city full of so much immorality that it was very difficult to be a Christian there and not be affected by the influence of the culture around you, not unlike living pretty much anywhere in the United States today. And this idea that sex is just an appetite to be fulfilled has become prominent in our context, in your and I's context, since the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s. Its roots actually go back much deeper and can be seen in people like Sigmund Freud, Alfred Kinsey, and Wilhelm, who believed that the only proper response to sexual desire was its fulfillment, and that not to do so, like they actually believed this in the 60s, that to not fulfill all of your physical desires would cause cancer. All of this research, of course, was debunked even within their lifetime. The latter two, like the two fathers of the sexual revolution in the United States, Alfred Kinsey and then Wilhelm, whose first name I forget, within their lifetimes, the way that they got the results that they were seeking within the research that led to the sexual revolution included things like pedophilia and sexual assault of the participants in their studies. And yet, despite that, it has led to this increasingly cavalier attitude towards sex in our culture, one that tells us we have a right to sexual gratification whenever we desire it, one that has led to the rise of vices such as pornography and adultery. And it is a problem. According to the Barna Research Group, only 3% of adult U.S. Christian males claim to have never viewed pornography. Approximately 2/3, 64% of Christian men admit that they view pornography at least monthly. With respect to Christian men between 18 and 30 years old, it's 70% who look at porn monthly and 36% who look at least daily. Within the Christian community, 54% of those identifying as born-again Christians admit to viewing porn at least monthly and 14% at least daily. In women, the number is closer to 20%. However, among young women, the number continues to increase. The survey also found that more than 1/3, about 35% of married men and 1 in 6 married women report having had a sexual encounter with someone other than their spouse while they were still married, and the number for Christian married men and women is exactly the same as the national average. So regardless of whether you're Christian or not, you are equally as likely to have an affair. And this is not what we're called to. We have to be a kind of people who are characterized by treating this gift of God with the respect and honor that it's due. We have to be the kind of people who take holiness so radically that we would do things like purchase a service such as Covenant Eyes or Canopy. Like, what I would like to see is every group of men in the church have some kind of thing on their phone and on their computer and on their devices where we can hold each other accountable to things on the internet. And for women too, for those who are interested or who need that. Like, we have to be the kind of people who, if we notice that someone in our circle of influence within the church is getting, outside the bounds of their marriage, that we love them enough to call them out and then to direct them back into their marriage. Right before the passage that we read today, we see in 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, this is Paul talking. He says, "Do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God." Paul takes these sins deadly seriously. The word there for the sexually immoral, someone who practices sexual immorality, is just a personal form of the Greek word that's used generally for sexual immorality, and it's the word porneia, where we get our English word porn from. Porn and adultery make an idol out of sex and sexual gratification. They lead to divorce, they lead to addictions, they lead to separation from God. Unsurprisingly, in that same study I quoted earlier, people who view porn on a regular basis, even Christians, even born-again Christians, report feeling farther away from God the more they engage with pornography. Not because God is turning his back on the one watching porn or engaging in extramarital affairs, but because those acts do what all sin does. They take our focus off of Christ and they give it to idols. They give it to things that are not God. A Christian approach to sex is that sex is only to be had within the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman, and it's not merely an appetite to be satisfied, it's something more than that. Try before you buy, live together before you're married. It's a myth. Scientifically, people who sleep together before they're married are more likely to get divorced than those who don't. And honestly, it's just terrible because you're living in an interview, judging whether or not this person is going to be able to satisfy you sexually before you decide to commit your life to them. Sex is more than that. It's a gift of God that should be used properly as an act of worship to God and should be treated not without respect. Hebrews 13:4 puts it very plainly. It says, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure. For God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Do we not have that one, Maya? I thought I put it in there. That's all right, though. Hebrews 13:4. You could look it up later. The other end of the spectrum is the view that sex is a degrading or a disgraceful act that should not be had except for the purpose of procreation and certainly should never be enjoyed. That's the beginning of 1 Corinthians 7. It says, now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. Notice that that's in quotations. And then Paul says, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. This view comes from those who had a mindset similar to the Pharisees, one that elevates adherence to the rules over actually pursuing holiness in Christ. And we've already discussed this one briefly at the beginning, so I'm going to spend less time here. But one particular group of Christians that I think gets a bad rap for having this kind of mindset is the Puritans. Everybody, like if you look up the word prude online and then you look at its synonyms, the word Puritan is a synonym for the word prude. But the funny thing about that is the Puritans were some of the most sex-positive Christians to have ever lived, as long as it was within the proper place of the marriage covenant. For example, the Puritan William Gouge wrote this in his journal. He says, husbands and wives should have intercourse with good will and delight, willingly, readily, and cheerfully. Puritan pastor Richard Baxter advised, keep your conjugal love in constant heat and vigor. That's a Puritan pastor. No grounds in Scripture can be found for considering anything in the intimate sharing of body and soul between a husband and wife as perverted or wrong, so long as there's mutual enjoyment. The Christian approach to sex is the one that views it within its proper place as a good gift of God, not as something that one cannot live without. As Paul notes, he's been given the gift of singleness, and he says that others will be given that gift also. Essentially, he's saying, if you're married, great. Stay that way. Don't get divorced. Only be physically intimate with your spouse. If you're not married, great. Don't pursue marriage as an idol. Don't elevate sex or marriage or romantic love to something that it's not. So we get both ends of those spectrum, which are wrong, which are not biblical. Let's talk finally about what holy sexuality actually is. Holy sexuality glorifies God and not pleasure, and it serves the desires of my spouse more than me. I'm going to say something that's going to make some of you not want to listen to me anymore, but just stick with me to the end. I promise it gets better. Sex is not about you. Sex is one of the most unifying acts that two people can participate in together, which is why it's meant to be held within the context of marriage, because you can't be uniting yourself to a bunch of different people. The word in Greek for unite or join together in the scriptures, join to a prostitute and then join to God in chapter 6, it's the same word, and it's a word that in Greek was used to describe two things that were permanently glued or cemented to each other. Like when you would cement something together, or they even used it medically, like if you had a big cut and they glued the two sides of your opened wound back to each other, that's the word used in chapter 6 for uniting. And so what happens, for example, when you glue two pieces of paper together and you pull them apart? Little pieces of each sheet of paper are left behind on the other sheet. Because sex is like a glue, it's a binder, it's a unifier. And so every time you are intimate with someone in that way, and then you pull apart, such as divorce, such as having sex with someone you're not married to, even pornography, you're gluing yourself to them spiritually and then ripping it apart. And inevitably, little pieces of you are going to be left with them, and little pieces of them are going to be left with you in a way that you cannot change. It's designed to represent the way that Jesus has bound himself with his people, the church. The coming together of husband and wife in marriage and in the sexual union is designed to unify the two people as one flesh and to praise Jesus for the love that he has for us, for the unity that he seeks with us. It's not just about doing something because you like it. The Christian sex ethic, Tim Keller says, was revolutionary. It introduced the idea of consent in sex. It made sex not about self-fulfillment, which always privileges the person with more power, but about creating lasting community that reflects God's relationship to us. This is a higher, not a lower view of sex, because it's a reflection of what God has for us. This is also why sex is only to be had within marriage, because it produces such oneness that it must be accompanied by oneness in all other areas of life. Sex without commitment is a moral charade. It's an outrageous distortion of reality to become naked with each other in body, but not naked with each other in soul. Until you share every aspect of your life together, the sharing of your bodies with one another is going to lead to disillusionment. It's going to lead to distortion. It's going to lead to confusion and ultimately to heartbreak. To experience physical intimacy without emotional and spiritual closeness undermines relational intimacy. In the same way that sex is designed to glorify God more than it is to provide me with enjoyment, it's also primarily an act of service to your spouse. Chapter 7 says that neither the husband nor the wife should deny physical intimacy to one another unless it's agreed upon and it has an agreed upon end time. This is not a license for manipulation or sexual pressuring, but a call to radical, life-giving love to one another. And if one spouse is refusing sexual intimacy, it's not an excuse for the other spouse to go outside of the marriage to look for that fulfillment. It's a reason to go deeper into the marriage, to figure out what spiritual and emotional problems exist underneath so that you can come back together, not just physically, but spiritually and emotionally as well. It's a small picture of the radical self-giving love that Christ has for his church. That he loved us so much that despite us looking like a broken rose that's been passed around a room of college students, he saw fit to come down in the form of the Son, to die a death on the cross that we deserved, to be the substitutionary sacrifice on our behalf so that we could be brought into an intimate, eternal relationship with the God who created us and who loves us. Near the end of the letter to the church in Ephesus, Paul says, when talking about marriage in Ephesians 5, he says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ in the church. The marriage picture, the love picture of marriage, the only appropriate context for the unification that is sexuality. The picture is a picture of the way that Christ wants to be united to you. Like at a deep soul level, with the kind of self-giving, sacrificial love that would do whatever it takes to make sure that at your core, no matter what's going on around you in life, you can be satisfied because your rest is not in the things of this world. It's not in the pursuit of the desires of your flesh, but it's in the God who loved you and gave himself for you so that you could be with him for eternity. We live in an age that's just as confused, if not more so, about God's design for sex than the city of Corinth was 2,000 years ago. And yet you and I have been given an opportunity as Christ's ambassadors to set an example to the world on how to approach sex in a way that is sanctified, in a way that is without judgment, but also does not compromise the truth. A truth that is both convicting and yet so rewarding and beautiful, that sex is powerful, that it's good, and that outside of marriage, it is harmful. But within the covenant of marriage, marriage being the only human relationship said to describe the relationship between Jesus and his church, his body, sex has been given as a gift, an opportunity to experience whole life oneness with your partner in life and ministry, one that has the potential to produce a family, one that serves the other person as an opportunity to participate with and to enjoy God and glorify Him forever.